That's right. So we don't have to say anything. We don't have to say welcome to the blah 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 podcast. You're going to tag something at the beginning to tell people what this is?
Well, you've started it. So what? We can just keep going. Let's set the context for these lovely people. What's happening, Brennan?
Oof, well, we decided. Maybe I decided. Maybe you decided. Maybe we both decided that we would draw back the wonderful Wizard of Oz curtain and say, like, you know, we always do these episodes and it sounds like, oh, boy, those guys know what they're talking about. They got like, oh, here's what it's like, and here's the babies. That's the good stuff, and here's the bathwater. But the secret is, the week before, we bang our heads repeatedly against the wall and we're like, I don't think we can talk about this. Either there's way too much, like on this assessment, it's like, this is like 10 hours. Or it's like school uniform buttons or whatever. And it's like, we don't really have enough to say. But then we get into it and there's always something. Sometimes it takes like a week to marinate. So I guess the point was, what would it sound like if we just like pressed record? This is the last.
It would probably just sound like click. That would be the sound of us pressing record.
Click.
This meeting is now being recorded.
Tape machine. But this is the last episode of the Orangeman.
Good code word for that.
This is the last episode of the season that we've been doing for a long, long time on the Mainstream School, which is Orange in the Spiral Dynamics. So when we're chatting, we generally just call them Orange or Orangeman or Orange Woman or Orange Person. Just Orange. This the shorthand, because Mainstream is
or the Orange School. Orange School.
Orange is 1.5 syllables. But Mainstream is 2, so saves us a bit of time. So we say that, and it's a very messy process. But I think after doing 90 odd episodes, I think you know, our loyal, diehard fan base might want to hear just Rob and Brendan. Just how do you get it so polished?
Yeah, and we're far from polished, but I think what we wanted to show is the thought process that goes into this, because the podcast for you and I is still an open inquiry. And as you were alluding to, we kind of put out an episode every 2 weeks. We record 1 week, but the week prior to that, we're fleshing these things out because we don't have the words for this stuff yet. It's not like you and I started 100 episodes ago with all of these detailed notes.
All the scripts written.
What are you up to? Even just for the Mainstream season, this is what, 50 something pages of notes that we've got at this point. Like, we didn't have any of this. We're figuring this stuff out together. It's an open inquiry week to week. You and I are trying to like clarify, reduce down, well, not reduce down, but like simplify down the key characteristics of traditional mainstream and progressive education. And let's pretend we're a little bit in a normal episode and just say, if you're not sure what traditional mainstream or progressive would be defined as, skip ahead to the last 5 minutes of this episode. We've got our little intro tutorial glossary about the terminology we're using here.
It's like anti-kayfabe.
Mm-hmm. My favorite ant.
Exactly. But we're not starting from absolutely nothing. So when we started it, traditional or blue kind of inquiry into this, we didn't know that we would do an episode on community outreach. It was kind of only through, we actually did it, and I don't want this just to turn into a meta episode about how we wrote the first 90 odd episodes, but we did.
But you also do.
I do and I don't. I do and I don't. I do want this to be an actual kind of like us picking apart the bones of this idea, but we're not starting from nothing. So we started with the traditional, and we kind of just brainstormed what community outreach might be, which is the next episode that we're looking at. And those notes in a simplified form is kind of where we're starting from. So, you know, I've got a bunch of notes here that say school is not an island. It functions within a local community. And in 2020 something, it's a global community. So we kind of start there, I guess. And so, yeah, I mean, should we have a look at what community outreach might mean in a mainstream school by using notes on traditional school to kind of provide a springboard, if you will?
Yeah, so it seems like almost every piece of what we describe the traditional school as ends up contrasting in some way to what the mainstream representation looks like. And basically, we have like two categories. We look at our traditional notes, and then we either say, oh, mainstream is the opposite of that, or, oh, mainstream still does that, but for a totally different reason. And it's typically one of two boxes. And I think this one, right off the bat, is the category of mainstream does the opposite thing. So if traditional school is not an island, it functions within a local community. A mainstream school, of course, will say it is part of the local community, but it is not functioning or embedded within the community the way a traditional school was. In fact, the school, as we've said many times throughout this episode, is acting as an independent social entity within the community, and you could more or less pick it up and move it geographically almost anywhere in the world, and most of it's going to kind of remain the same or intact. Would you not support that idea?
I would, and I would say that harkening back to the last couple of episodes about how parents became less involved in the day-to-day running of the school as basically the state took over. It's the same kind of idea. And, the romantic traditional notion of the little village school where everybody contributes, and the Peppa Pig episode you talked about last time, which is, it is the world of children's cartoons where this world still exists, where the little village school exists. And if the roof's leaking, then the plumber will come around and try and fix, and then they'll do a bake sale and everybody will kind of like patch up the roof. But the mega school down the street doesn't really operate in the same way. It's like that community in itself doesn't even really exist anymore. So most of our schools are serving, especially at the junior high school and high school, they're serving kids that are coming from 10, 20, 30 minutes away, sometimes hours away, especially a school like ours, which is international school. None of our kids live, almost none of them live within walking distance of the school. They're all coming on public transport, to the extent that the very traditional Japanese school down the road still has parent volunteers doing road crossing in the morning. So all the kind of what they might call the silver service. So the old ladies and gentlemen, and the odd kind of mum or dad is kind of like helping to cross roads. Our international serving community that serves kids from coming much, much further afield, we don't actually have that. We do a lot of community activities. We had one today where the parents came and it was fantastic, but the parents came from all over the city. And I know as an international school, that doesn't really, you can't really make an analogy to your local mainstream school in England or Canada or whatever, but it's not that kind of community that you can draw on. That romantic community doesn't even exist anyway. And because you're not in, even if it did exist, the way the school operates, it almost like its own state-run little walled garden or independent autonomous thing, doesn't need the community anymore, which is, when presented in that way, is pretty sad. It's a pretty sad kind of look at things. If you're looking back to the good old days when the community supported school, and now it's totally cut off and it doesn't need it anymore. But there's a lot more to it than that, as we always kind of find out as we pick our way through this.
Yeah, and I think I'm trying to think of like pros and cons of that, because that does sound rather stark to say like schools have evolved into, serving a system where they can exist without the community. I guess to some degree, by being less reliant on the community and its resources and extracting it to a higher state level. The one advantage is, if your community is not that wealthy, theoretically, that is helped by the state, and your school is not hindered by the shortcomings or difficulties associated with your community. Is that fair to toss out?
Yeah,
and also to go back to your one previous point, I don't know if these two things are connected, but we're talking about community, and we're saying, yeah, your school or even mine, you've got people from all over the city. There's still some community. There's like an inner community, but like we're talking about something about like the dispersal of geographic community. There's something different when you're not walking by the school after school because it's part of the neighborhood. You're not getting bused 50 minutes across the city like some of the students. It's like, see, this is where we get into the messy tangents, especially on my part. Sort of like traditional was more the inner community, and the physical community were physically located near the school, and the school is like a locus of the physical space. Now it's extended that, theoretically, no one lives anywhere near each other in their lives outside of school, but there is still like what we would call the lower left, or that shared sense of identity of being in the school. Do you see what I'm trying to get at there?
Yeah, and it's all tied into the last couple of episodes. We did the one about the parents and teachers relationship, which had changed to become much more of this kind of like less hierarchical and more kind of like we're both sharing support for that particular student in a transparent way. And then we moved on to parent roles in the school, which the irony was that as the school developed into this mainstream role, we actually, all those roles became professional and therefore had no room for the parents. And I think this is almost the flip of that, to say like, while the school no longer needed a parent volunteer or a parent librarian, because those were all funded and even professional kind of thing, it's the same thing now. It's like, what is that community outreach as a school? What does it benefit from actually reaching out to the people who live in that kind of neighborhood? I would still say that, especially at primary school, most mainstream schools still, the kids live within walking distance or driving distance, like 10-minute drive of the school. So there is still a possibility for that connection, but those things don't exist either. It's like the romantic notion. Like we used to, when I was a kid, there was 3 police stations within probably 15 minutes of my house. Now there isn't one until you get into the local town. It's like those police stations had like 2 people in them. And the good old days of the British Bobby riding around on his bicycle. But I grew up in the end of that. That was still a thing when I was at school I started school in 1978. So it's like, that was still a thing. And there was still the local bakers and the local butcher shops. It was the end of that era. Go back another generation, and that's what we were in. But I don't think you can have like that romantic notion and not address the harsh realities of life at that time as well, because people have much more comfort in many ways now, even though there may not be as much security in some areas. That's another massive tangent I might go off on, but it's just, the world just has changed so that community no longer exists in the same form. And so the thing that we would ask ourselves in this question is like, so schools traditionally, you go way back into the romantic past and the one-room schoolhouse and the small village school or whatever, they did reach out to the local community to help them meaningfully to build things. And actually my dad, I've said this a few times before, when I was a kid, he came and built like a wooden play area on the front of the school. Now that would have been paid for. And we have one in our school that we paid for, that was quite pricey, but he's really nice. But then we, again, too many tangents, but going off into what we talked about with Mark White, who works at my school, he's bringing back the loose parts play, which is very much more the progressive thing, bringing back in. But it's different. Is like, I guess, circling around the idea of does a mainstream school reach out to the community for anything? The local community, that's really hard to say. What does a mainstream school right now, do they reach out to the local community in any meaningful way? The parent community, the actual parents who are part of the school, maybe. Global communities, so actually, reaching to schools overseas, watching things on YouTube and connecting with people who might provide services for the school, whether those are digital and online or somebody coming in physically into the school. The chance of anything that happening in your local, within a few miles radius of the school, it really is kind of its own island at this point.
Yeah, and the things I can think of are one-offs or very short-term things. There might be a community cleanup day. That was a common thing when I was in high school. For Earth Day, usually you get 3 hours to go pick up garbage or recycling or tidy up or weed an area or something like that. But yeah, as far as bringing in experts, you'll still see police come in a mainstream school. It might be, especially in Germany, the police will provide you your bike training so that you can have your road safety license and things like that. Those things still exist. Parent volunteers for lice checks, but again, that's just the parent community helping out. Maybe for special events, like we mentioned in the traditional thing, maybe getting local artists, and you put, but never the local crack dealer. They get overlooked on these ones. You might bring in a local musician, a local entertainer for a special event. But I think that's the thing I'm hitting up against here is they're one-offs or they're very short-term things. I guess maybe one of the few would be something like a co-op in high school. I remember my last year of high school, I think in your last 2 years, you had the option you could do a co-op, which was you would go essentially for a day, a week, or we had a weird schedule. I won't get into that, but half of your time for a semester, you would go to a local business and essentially volunteer in exchange for credits and, do a few assignments about things about how the business works and what you're learning and journals and stuff like that. And someone would oversee that. But I don't even know if I'd consider that community outreach necessarily. But that's one of the few places where you'd be outside of the school in the actual local business community, having a relatively authentic part, depending on how you were used.
Yeah, well, but there. even that is already moving quite into the mainstream thing of work prep or whatever. It's so we would call it work placement or whatever, something like that, where you would just go out and do a mini apprenticeship for a few days or a week or something like that. Arguably, that's far more mainstream than, even though it's been going on quite a long time. It's a weird one. Again, it's one of those of the apprentice model is purely traditional, that hierarchical feudal kind of model, whereas the kind of hired worker is the mainstream. But the purpose of sending somebody out is not for you to become that person's apprentice. It's for you to just get a taste of a couple of types of work to decide which area you might go in. So I'd argue that even that may have happened in a traditional school, but it definitely would happen in a mainstream school. So that one area of community outreach would be the older children would definitely go out there and begin to experience work within the community.
Take your kids to work day? Where does that one fit in?
Yeah, I'd say that's the same thing. That's an earlier version of that. It's just a taster of what the world of work looks like. And this is where it kind of gets muddy because nothing's ever one thing, right? Of course, people who take their kid to work, if you're a traditional parent, you might have a totally different set of reasons why you're taking your kid to work, to show them how your duties and how you upheld your responsibilities to the community. if you're a mainstream parent, you might be taking your kid to work so that they can see, how the world of work kind of like operates, so that they can make some wise decisions for the career path they want to take. And if you're a progressive parent, taking your kid to your local bespoke artisan granola shop, maybe it's to show how that you bring the community together based around your egalitarian working practices.
No, but all three could take your kid to some corporate office job, but for different reasons. They don't even have to be different jobs. That's the thing.
Sure, you can. And so this is where it gets a bit messy. But I think one thing to be sure is that in terms of community outreach, one thing the mainstream would pursue further is sending kids out as they get older into the community to do jobs, but not for any type of service per se. One thing that's coming right now in progressive, and especially in the IB kind of arguably progressive leaning thing, is that, service towards the community, service as action, like I'm actually taking action to change the community. Service or duty traditionally, when you go to the old people's home to give them, to sing carols for them or to help out or whatever, again, it's another example of how the traditional and progressive might do a very similar thing, but for very different reasons. So the traditional you might go and pick litter or whatever, or go to the pensioners' home out of your duty and your tradition and your respect for the hierarchy and for your elders. A progressive school might send you there to kind of enact change in your community, to kind of like kind of make the lives of the older people in the community more fun, more meaningful, whatever. So it looks very similar, but there's a different underlying purpose. I don't know why the mainstream would send you out there, so that you could get work experience in case you ever decided to work in an old people's home. Is that too calculating?
No, I don't think that would be the intention. It's like, in retrospect, it might be seen as an opportunity. I'm just wondering if this is the same as like our parental involvement episode in the school. You alluded to this already, but I wonder if this isn't just the flip side, which is when we move to mainstream, parental involvement essentially leaves the school and is replaced by hired experts, qualified people who are paid for and overseen by the school. I'm wondering if this is kind of the flip side. As we move to mainstream, it's sort of like the community to some degree gets pushed away, or what used to be gathered from the community is now done abstractly through other means that are not dependent on what a community could offer. It's not to say there's no place for it, but I would lean towards it's entirely optional if it could be seen as an additional resource to what you are able to provide within the school.
I think so.
I don't think there's any mainstream head of school that would word it that way. That's not how someone would see it, but from the outside, that's what I'm seeing.
Because you'd have to justify the time spent as well.
The time spent, and also this was going through my head when we were talking about the integration in the community. Just legally, there are very few schools where you can leave the school grounds without legal parental permission. It's not like, hey, this is of interest. Well, let's go to the park and check that out. It's like, oh, just got to fill out the field trip form. Can you guys send this home, sign off that we can leave the school for a few hours next week when we do this? Cool. Like all that spontaneity, all those things are gone also within this more legal binding framework that mainstream schools find themselves in the 2000s.
Yeah. So as we hit this point, about 20 minutes into our discussion, it's like, this is a total mess. It's like, what have we even got so far? The fact that school no longer really has a community in the same sense to reach out. Or it's
not dependent on the community in the same sense, and therefore doesn't reach out.
Yeah, but I also think, like I said, the community doesn't exist in the same sense, and it also wants different things. So, and that's also part of. Sure, we still do have the fire service, and we still do have a local doctor, and we still do have these kind of people around us that we could call in. And actually, that still plays some part. But I think the world is wider, and it's like you can go on YouTube and watch a bunch of videos from really entertaining people who are probably better at presenting that information than the person in your community.
So or hire in some kind of program.
Yeah, so much more experience, maybe, or more. A better ability of how to present their information. And sure, it isn't the same kind of question answer back and forth. Although those are available too. So our kids now are doing this thing called the exhibition, where they're all kind of planning their own, kind of units of inquiry and stuff. And they all try to reach out to experts in a certain field. And many of them were able to actually talk to somebody who could have been anywhere in the world, and they were able to ask them questions on their very specific thing. That's where the mainstream would begin to reach out. It's like your community is becoming global, and the community is a research, like you type in a resource, sorry. So it's like the community isn't just this thing that you interact with now and again, and it's common sense that the police officer comes around and gives you a talk on road safety or whatever. It's like, no, actually we could, there's far more resources digitally and globally now that we can actually tap into for things like road safety, or investigating animal welfare, or global disputes, as some of the kids have investigated in this kind of unit.
And maybe this is where even our generating of what are some examples of this gets difficult, because I think it becomes up or gets handed over to the individual discretion of teachers or teams of when do we do these things. Oh, well, there's the one teacher, she always does the sing the Christmas carols, but the parallel class doesn't, because that teacher doesn't want it. Or this one last year did take them to the dump, but this year they decided they're not going to because it wasn't very well organized or whatever it is. Like, there are these things in the traditional school where it wouldn't be a question. It'd be like, oh, well, in September, we always go there. Now things aren't being done for tradition's sake or because we always did them. It's up to individual teacher discretion whether we do these things or not. And therefore, this sounds like I'm saying it in a negative way, but it doesn't create any coherent series of ongoing or even necessarily long-term connections to the community. These can all be one-offs where it's efficient and effective for us.
Yeah, it doesn't exist in the community in the same sense anymore. And that can be isolated. And that's one of the criticisms of, when we get to the bathwater, there's criticisms of mainstream teaching before you start to get back into collaboration. But I mean, it's been true of traditional teaching too. It's an isolating job potentially, but if you're also stripped from that community and the tradition, and you are a teacher in a mainstream school, and your job is to deliver the curriculum and assess the curriculum, and you're pretty much entirely responsible for that yourself, that can be incredibly isolating. It's not. And again, a lot of this sounds negative, and that's why, thank goodness, we have the babies section where we have to focus on good stuff, because as much as the romantic notion of the community probably didn't really exist in that much in the schools of the 30s and 40s and 50s, it still was there. I don't think it's there anymore. And I think the benefit, if we get to the babies, is that you've now thrown the net much wider, and you can reach out globally for these resources, and you're not limited by what's in your local community. So the drawback of not really having that community anymore can be overcome by creating a network, using communications technologies to create essentially a network. So there's nothing wrong with you reaching out. Now, whether or not mainstream schools actually do this is a whole other thing, but there's nothing to stop you reaching out to the schools all over your area or in all over the world to collaborate and communicate with. I know I'm going on a bit here, but when I first started teaching in England, and there's a lot of money being put into IT at that time. And so we were one of the first schools in the area. They piloted, it was like a low income area, but they piloted this thing where, like, I think 6 schools all got like hundreds of little tiny like laptop kind of things. They're probably like the same size like a Switch or something like that. Nintendo Switch, not much bigger than that. Touch screen, but they recorded audio and even video and stuff like that. And so we were part of a network of 6 schools, and we collaborated on the kind of rudimentary platforms with the other schools, and we had meetings with them. And that was, I guess, a community. And there was a kind of little festival at the end, and we actually went down to a technology show in London, like 4 or 5 kids from each school. We went down. So that was an artificially created network bringing together schools that had an interest in technology. And so, this is where, I guess this is when we exhaust all of the obvious things, then we start digging into these kind of ideas. But essentially, just like in the good old days or the bad old days, if you were the only Pink Floyd fan in your town, or if you were the only person that liked dirt biking, you might be a little bit isolated in your own community. So for all of the romantic notions of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker living just down the road, if you were not mainstream, shall we say, ironically, if you were not part of that, the core of that community, it'd be quite isolating. But with the internet and other communication things now, you can, no matter how obscure the things you are interested in, you can join a network. You can, like right now, I do that podcast about The Fall. They're a pretty obscure post-punk band, yet we get, there's multiple Facebook groups. There's 3 podcasts on that band.
And if you were trying to find guys in Osaka to get a Fall podcast up and running, you're likely going to have a hard time.
Yeah, I mean, and the smaller your community, the harder it is. It's remember when eBay first came out, a lot of background in music, and people were just losing their minds over the fact this rare record they had is now worth almost nothing because there's thousands of them on eBay, whereas before you were the only person who had it. So that's the flip side of that. And to tie that all back to the community outreach, if you're in a school and you're a student or a teacher or, whatever, if you are not completely in line with the philosophy and practices of that school and the traditional school, you're kind of stuck. However, these days, I can reach out and make a network of people that are really interested in a specific type of art teaching or a specific type of inquiry-based learning, or, we talked a long time ago about unschooling. Go on the internet, there's multiple unschooling communities. So I guess what we're saying is the mainstream has just made it so that you can find your own community rather than having to rely on the one that you just happen to live in.
Yeah, and you are being handed what you're supposed to focus on from the state and from the curriculum. So in part of this ensuring standardization that everyone gets a fair shake on this, we're losing the local community curriculums or local ideas about what's important, moving up to the state level. And whether you're in downtown Toronto or a flying community in Northern Ontario, what's happening within the school has clear aims and focuses, regardless of what the community or landscape looks like outside of it. I'm not sure I said anything there. I think there's negatives and positives with that, though.
I think the most negative thing there, which is true, is that, because you've got a centralized curriculum, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which town or city you live in. That's been one of the criticisms of a national curriculum. And the national curriculums actually came in from the left generally because of that idea to kind of balance the playing fields. And it was when in Britain, the Tony Blair and the kind of New Labour brought all that in, like short start programs for early readers or early literacy and classroom assistants and a national curriculum and standardized testing, all was aiming to serve the purpose of leveling the playing field for better or worse. And to be focused on the idea of a national curriculum, once the Conservatives got back in power, they did this move that to an outsider might look like it's more progressive, almost, of freeing up the curriculum. But then you look at the reason why they did it. It's so that those traditional schools with a lot of money and a lot of resources can do whatever they want. They're no longer beholden to a national curriculum that the left has kind of imposed on them. And I guess that's a way to say basically that mostly is going to be a negative within a community, because you are saying that you have to follow this curriculum, and that's what your kids are going to be marked on, and that's what we're going to assessment, and we're going to rank your schools based on how well they do, and the kids' qualifications, therefore their job opportunities, are going to be heavily tied to this. So sure, you can do it if you like. You can meaningfully interact with your local community if you like, but if you do that, you're going to come lower in the league table, and you're going to end up putting the jobs of the staff at risk and so on, and incurring the wrath of Ofsted. Now, whether there's truth in that is a whole other thing, but it's certainly the threat that hangs over schools. And again, the romantic.
Well, there's something there where community involvement, as far as I'm aware, might show up in terms of values in a curriculum. But I can't think of any specific curriculum objectives in curriculums that I've seen that say, as part of the national curriculum, you will, students can do X in their local community, right? Like the curriculum itself doesn't require authentic action, or it doesn't require you to leave the school walls in any way. That's just bonus. Shoot me down. Is that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. But I think it's like we're getting off into other things such as the meaningful nature of the curriculum. But there's really important in this area to say, like in a mainstream school, you might get a curriculum objective. Like I remember one in the geography in primary was to compare a rural and a urban kind of setting. Sure, but it doesn't matter how you compare it really, or even what it is. There's some stipulations. You compare sizes. You compare like the kind of the
population density,
the density, and of course, and like the services available and so on like that. You should do some basic comparisons of the thing, which would allow you to interpret that on a fairly kind of surface level. It doesn't matter whether you look at your own community or a random rural community, for example, because you're just looking at a community as if it was a textbook or a piece of paper, with something written on there. You're not engaging with that community. And that's the criticism of the mainstream, the abstracting of, so we're getting into the bathwaters here, the progressive definitely would hammer the mainstream for abstracting the curriculum away from any form of meaning. Like it can never have a meaningful connection to the community because you've abstracted it so much that it applies to everything. Now you could use that as a springboard to have inquiries, which is kind of how, in an inquiry school, you use the curriculum. You could use those kind of like compare an urban and a rural setting. Sure, you could use that as the beginning of an inquiry, and it would lead you into some interesting places. Mainstream is not going to ask you to do that. The mainstream is basically saying, do this because at some point on a test or some form of standardized assessment, this is probably going to come up. Mainstream wouldn't really agree with that in its broad sense, but in school, that's how it works. It's basically everything is geared towards the curriculum, i.e. everything is geared towards getting higher scores on the standardized tests that invariably pop up in your geography or history when you get into middle school and high school. The backwards designed from those tests rather than deducing reality from the clues that you find around you. Which is all to say that this is all sounding pretty grim, other than the ability for you to create your own community and interact with it. That seems to be the saving grace so far, to be like a mainstream school allows you to reach out and interact with people that you might never have any connections with, and collaborate with them and do meaningful work in theory. In practice, though, I think you wouldn't find that happen quite so often. And so that isolation, the walled garden, as it's sometimes called, is what you actually end up with in practice.
I think the only thing we haven't discussed here is the idea of field trips. Mainstream field trips. I have a sense there is still a lot of that traditional thing lingering over, like, oh, well, that's a good place to go. But in the mainstream, I'm kind of, when I think of the roster of people I've worked with who I'd argue are mainstream leaning, there's sort of two extremes. One is the almost never does field trips unless someone else is doing it and they're just a part of it. And then there's we do a field trip every 2 weeks for every unit we're doing, and or some activity to get out of this place into the larger world as a, culminating activity to our unit or something like that. Or it's just a breath of fresh air, or kids are then more motivated during the in-school lessons for it idea. And they'll couch it in language about, it's an authentic experience. It's bringing the classroom to life. To me, there's something there that ties into this idea that, it's the mainstream teacher's job to find a way to make the curriculum relevant to you. Like in traditional, it's just the teacher's job to get through the curriculum and like, you better do it. Progressive is let's find what's meaningful and maybe create curriculums or, find ways to extend the curriculum to your own meaning. But mainstream, it's kind of on the shoulders of the teacher to the dismissive thing would to say like the razzle dazzle, the edutainment side of things. The positive is to help you make those connections yourself and find authentic meaning in these things. And an extension of that could be field trips into the local community to make some of those contacts. But again, I keep coming back to this idea of in mainstream, things seem to be, I guess only because I can't think of other examples, seem to be more focused on one-offs than any kind of like year-long ongoing thing. I'm not able to draw on any examples I can think of.
No, I'd give you that. I think So a traditional school will do some field trips, and it'll probably be the same ones they take every year, and they may be connected to local festivals and rituals and things, and almost certainly not intentionally related to the curriculum. And again, if you're out there thinking, oh, that's not true, it is true. If you go back far enough into the romantic past, and sure, yeah, then, in 2021, even the most traditional school is probably still taking field trips with one eye on the curriculum to some degree. But they're less likely to do kind of religious services and harvest festivals or trips out to the Japanese primary schools often go digging up sweet potatoes every year. So this is every grade 2 class in Japan probably goes out to the fields to dig up sweet potatoes. Don't know who started it. Probably a wily farmer. And,
every Ontario class goes apple picking in September to early October.
So that's a tradition, right? And it may a canny mainstream teacher might tie it to the curriculum, but that's not why it's there. Whereas a mainstream teacher would, aside from the fact that you said earlier, still need to do the risk assessment and go and visit the site and all of that stuff in advance. But they'd almost certainly need to tie it into the curriculum. So you're talking visits to science museums, you're talking visits. There may still be some hands-on. You may go and visit an orchard, but it's because you're studying, apples or, some form of agriculture or whatever. It's tied in entirely to the curriculum. That's why you're going. Whereas,
yeah. I'll throw this one. No, sorry, finish your point, and then I'll throw in this.
Well, I was going to go off on a little tangent into when you get to the progressive, maybe you are going somewhere on an ongoing thing. So you go to the orchard on a monthly basis. So you're starting to actually, once again, integrate yourself into that community to make a change. Maybe you're building the orchard or whatever. Or maybe there's more student agency and choice. So my daughter just went on a field trip today, and she was part of the student government, and it was thrown out to the government a few months ago. Would you like to go on some field trips towards the end of the year? Yes, we would. Okay, right. Start planning them. So they planned 2 field trips this week, and one's the trampoline park. It's a whole lot of fun. No connection to the curriculum whatsoever, and also not a tradition. It really was just for fun. Now, sure, in the mainstream you might let off some steam and so on, but in the green progressive, this was like, no, this was actually designs, and it was something meaningful to them, even though that meaning was actually just on a fun kind of level. So it's kind of
and although that sounds somewhat strawman traditional, I think that idea of field trip as a bonus for an extra duty is a mainstream leaning thing, where it's like, oh, you guys were on student council, or you did this thing. I can think of many examples of that. Oh, you were the sport helpers. You guys get, I think almost the traditional version. No, I don't think this is real, but might be leaning to more, or it's like, oh, you get an in-house pizza party, folks. We talked about the pizza parties.
It's the treat. Club. I think the treat, the kind of, yeah.
Whereas the field trip is like, you guys were the student government. Yeah, we're going to go to the EU Parliament for the day. You guys can check that out as your bonus field trip. Thanks.
Maybe. That's not to say that it's all boring ass stuff in the mainstream, but it's especially you get into junior high and high school. I think if it's not connected heavily to the curriculum, then you've got to make a real case for it. And I think there is still a case for letting off steam and inspiration and stuff. But I think that's either the blue traditional or the green progressive sneaking back in at the window and saying, hey, people have worked hard. Because I think we give the mainstream its credit that it does say you can't just work people to death, but in its unhealthiest form, it is like, no, the reward is just that you're getting better. You don't need any other external rewards. Just the fact that you're studying and getting better and learning, and that'll get you better scores and make you a better student. That's enough. You don't need to let off steam. You don't need to adhere to any tradition or a deeper ritual meaning. It's just like, dude, This is going to get you. This is going to get you more knowledge. It's going to get you ahead.
The one
again, this straw
funny
man
example.
Bit, you know.
Well, this is a funny one because it proves, I think, your point. So I'm trying to tie two things together: field trips and authentic community experiences, even if not involvement. So months ago, my current grade 6 class, we did a project. It was tying in things from the curriculum about persuasive arguments, creating persuasive arguments, about presentations. There was, 5 or 6 kind of curriculum things all bundled together. The gist of the thing was students presented a suggestion for an English themed field trip, because I'm an English teacher. I teach English as a second language. They needed to present the argument to go on a field trip in their neighborhood, with the intention that we could learn a little bit more about the different neighborhoods, because my school is kind of like what we were talking about at the start of the year, or at the start of this episode, where kids are scattered all over Brussels, and many of them don't know the other neighborhoods that some of these kids live in and the cool things that are there. So it was, the curriculum side, 5 or 6 things bundled together, and then sort of the side thing, our school's ongoing desire is to make sure kids have a more authentic experience of what life in Belgium is like while, they're here for a few years and get to see some of the cool things that are here. And this was a way to kind of sneak in, getting informed about some of the other cool neighborhoods and stuff that goes on. But of course, all under the guise that, hey, this needs to be English themed in some way, that there'd be some way we could practice either our speaking, listening, reading, or writing in English while we do this field trip. Lots of great ideas from the students. And we threw in a bit of the mainstream thing that in the end, the students will get to vote on all these ideas. You can't vote for your own, but we'll vote for a field trip idea. And the winning one was a 3-part combo of let's go see an English film at the Stockel Theatre. Let's go out for lunch for ramen at the ramen shop across from the theater.
The local English ramen shop.
The local English ramen shop. And then head to the park. We can bring some English games or whatever, or we just agree that while we're playing around on the equipment, we'll speak in English. And it was like, okay, you guys ticked enough of the boxes. That sounds good. Crunch time comes. We're trying to organize this. We're realizing it has to happen on a Wednesday. And if we're going to do that, the film takes up this much time. Talk to the ramen place. They speak English. They're totally happy to give a little mini guided tour of their process for making ramen and offer suggestions at home, all this sort of stuff. It's Belgium, so you can never count that it's not going to rain. So the outdoor part was always a little bit suspect, but fine. In the end, we realized just simply for timing logistics, guys, it's either going to be the ramen or the movie. And if the weather's decent, we can sneak in the park for a few minutes, waiting for the movie, or while some people are finishing up their food, whatever. In the end, the movie is the thing that got voted. Okay, if we only have time for really the movie and maybe the park, movie over ramen. This concern the whole time was, guys, we can't guarantee what movie will be coming up weeks from now because, the theater doesn't have freedom over which things they have. Huge bonus. Thor, Love and Thunder is coming out on the day we booked it.
Ooh la la.
Students are going to get to see the new Marvel movie hours before it will be shown at the theater to the general public. We're getting a private screening to go see. And, it's the only movie we have a choice of. That's the kid-appropriate movie for that week. Then it comes time for me to craft the parent letter. And to me, it just looked like, on face value, just like looks like Rob's taken them to see the Marvel movie. Like the stupidest sounding field trip of all time that has nothing to do with the curriculum. Like
dubbed in French.
The movies, no, it will be in English, but I'll have French and Dutch subtitles underneath it. That's the funny part. But it just sounds so dumb. Like the flimsiest tie-in is like, well, we'll get to see the Stockel Theatre, which is like a pretty famous theater in Brussels. That's cool. But it just looks like, it's the end of the year. I'm going to take you to go see that new Marvel movie. And hey, we're booked before it comes out. How cool is that, guys? And it's like, no. Like, we actually had a much larger intention for this. And I had to craft the letter to be like, earlier in the year, You might remember your child's project where we presented a variety of options across a variety of neighborhoods across Brussels with a variety of suggestions. The most popular was this one. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we had to narrow it down to one of these, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to see the movie, blah, blah, blah. And like, it'd be great for your kids to see the Stop Go Theater if they never have. But it's, regardless of the intention, it's, we're going to see the new Marvel movie. And we're not doing the curriculum that day. And it'll still probably be the number one thing kids remember from the year. Hey, we got to see the new Marvel movie before it was released to the general public. Bit of a ramble chat there, but trying to tie in this idea that field trips should have some extension to the curriculum and be for a reason, not just let's get out of school and do something fun. In the mainstream view.
You get into this idea that the healthy mainstream would genuinely tie all field trips into the curriculum, but also make them fun and positive and meaningful, which is essentially what you've just done, right? But I know a mainstream kind of parent could view it as that. Okay, well, you know, they had the kids plan this and they went through all the plans and now they're carrying out their plan. And especially as you've talked about before, maybe they have to take the train there or whatever. You could tie it in and do all kinds of little hoops that they have to jump through to practice their communication skills, their math skills and whatever. It's like, it's a prime example for that. But what point is it just mental gymnastics?
Well, this is mental gymnastics.
It is, but it's not, because you genuinely did it because you wanted to give them an opportunity to meaningfully plan something that they could use their English. And if they were to walk away with that lesson to say, well, actually, there's multiple places in this city where I can, you know, explicitly decide to use my English. I could go to that ramen store. I could go to the park and play entirely in English or whatever. There's in the local library and just look through the English section or whatever. So you had a meaningful or a curriculum-based kind of reason for doing it. But then if you were a traditional or a progressive parent, it's like...
Why is my kid getting out of class for a morning to go see the new Marvel movie?
So that would be traditional. It could also be a mainstream parent who's not buying your reason. Sure, Rob, you went through this thing, but couldn't you have just told them good job but not want to see the movie? You just did the project. You didn't actually need to go and see the movie. Trip. No, because the experience of that to the mainstream is not of any real importance. The key was the process of planning the trip. And so it gets into all these kind of little bits, but what you did there to turn this back is you did use the local community and you found curriculum connections. And you actually put a little bit of that progressive green sheen on it and sprinkled some kind of student agency in there to be like, well, you get the choice. This is going to motivate you to research this and use some of those kind of transdisciplinary skills going across multiple subjects and all of those kind of things. So in its essence, it's got the core of some good, solid mainstream, even progressive leaning learning. But really, Rob, you just wanted to go and see Chris Hemsworth with his kit off, didn't you?
I like popcorn. Any excuse to have popcorn. Theater popcorn.
Looks like a great movie, actually. Looks like
I was questioning it. The trailer shows nudity, so I was imagining any parent being like, "Oh, the new Thor." Oh,
not really.
What's that one like? Oh yeah, the trailer's got it shows his bum in it.
Is it pixelated though? I just watched the trailer today.
Yeah. But still,
then
you know it's not pixelated in the movie, right?
Oh, is it not?
No.
It doesn't matter. It's like it's only a man's bottom.
Yeah, exactly.
And there we go. We've nailed community outreach.
We've finished at the male bottom. The one last piece I want to add that then, after thank you for defending my field trip, the one piece that then removes all of that is after we'd made all these decisions about a week ago in class. We were talking about something about online safety. And in our textbook, it was referring to online forums. And I had like a funny discussion because now this is like internet history. I'm like, you guys don't even know what online forums are. Those don't exist anymore. And I was like, just imagine 10 years from now, you guys in my position having to explain to kids what TikTok is. like, this is how absurd that in 10 years, these forums are gone. And I'm explaining, like, it's sort of like a comment section, but the comment section only existed to one website. And I was like, Reddit is the last thing that even resembles what these online forums look like.
Yeah.
So I was explaining it, and 2 of the kids in my class are on Reddit. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I kind of get it. And then so I went on Reddit, and I was like, what is good about these is you can crowdsource answers for things. So I went on to the Brussels Reddit thread, and I typed in, like, hey, what are ideas for good English themed field trips? And then the hilarious,
screw you, man.
Well, this was the funny part, was the next day there were 5 or 6 suggestions. And then we checked them out, and the feedback from my students was, because often I ask, like, hey, if I did this assignment with next year's grade 6s, what would you guys change, or what could we improve, what could make different, or whatever? And then their number one bit right away was like, oh, do like any of those ones that were on Reddit. That's way better than the stuff in my neighborhood. And so,
exactly.
Like,
yeah.
That was the, like, funny piece, which I think reinforces your idea. You're not stuck with your community. You can find these broader things. And, to be fair, half the list, a bunch of the kids are like, oh yeah, I've been to that already. And yeah, I've seen that. And then, they are some of the typical Belgian things. But there were some really cool suggestions where out of the 30 kids in my class, none of them had heard of this thing. And we opened up the website for a moment to have a look, and like, oh, actually that looks,
yeah, that's better.
I'd pick that over the movie. And it's just like, okay, cool. Maybe next year.
That comes into where mainstream gets pushed into the more progressive end, where it's like, okay, well, actually, instead of just brainstorming what we have and what we know, or reading the local newspaper, or asking our parents, why don't we go to Google and type in things to do in Brussels and try that as well? And so, I mean, that is, we started off with a fairly negative, isolating kind of thing, but the communities there crowdsourcing that information with people who live 2 streets away, but you would never have spoken to, but know everything about the local area and can give you hints and tips that you'd never would have come across. So silver linings as we hunker down into a world in which we never speak or acknowledge the things around us, and school is essentially a virtual island floating in the sky. No, so, babies and bathwaters, everyone.
I think we've sorted that out. And so the funny part, meta moment here, because you guys listening to this, if you're still with us, you haven't seen what's happening on our screen. As Brennan and I have been talking, both of us have a shared Google Doc open, and we've been typing these notes out, key bullet points of what makes a mainstream school outreach, talking with the babies, talking with the bathwaters. We've got all our notes, and now in theory, we kind of let some of these things marinate for about a week or so, and then we get back together next week, and we have these notes open in front of us and read bits of them, riff. I always get cringe when I hear that word, but go on tangents, perhaps repeat a few of the things we've talked about here, or, throughout the week, we'll think of, oh, actually, there's this other example too, and bring some new examples. So this is what happens behind the scenes of the episode. So for every episode we have up, Brendan and I have had one of these discussions to be able to generate and distill down some of these ideas of what makes each of these things, such as parent outreach, uniquely mainstream, or uniquely traditional, or uniquely progressive.
Yeah, I've enjoyed doing it this way. I don't know if it's something that we would want to do very often, but I think this kind of ramble chat, an hour or so, which eventually we've touched on everything that we will touch on in the actual episode. It's all in there. It's just a little bit more hazy and woven into each other. And I think next week, you'll get the more concise version in about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, rather than an hour.
Well, it's you and I, or at least me, I won't speak for you. It's me it's like, it's kind of there, foggy in my head. Maybe a few things need to be ironed out that aren't clear or I don't have yet. But it's kind of like, it takes me 5 minutes to say something here that in the actual episode hopefully takes me 1 minute. This is the like banding around, rambling, tell you the 5-minute story about my field trip to the movie theater, but I can distill it down to the 30-second essence when it's the actual episode kind of thing.
Yeah, and I don't know, like if I'm going to listen to a podcast, I do like the ramble, the long form. I want to listen to Rob talk for 5 minutes about which movie he's watching, rather than him just saying, yes, we planned this and we went here. So no, if let us know. Tie a note on a stone and throw it through our windows, and we'll tell you, you know, if you like this, we'll do some more of them. Maybe even get someone else on to kind of parse apart. This one was actually pretty straightforward. We did a bit of digging. It wasn't quite the revelation that some of the others, but I think we picked apart 4 or 5 different strands that all relate to how schools do and don't reach out to the local communities once you get to the mainstream. And if you're still listening, hopefully you see that it's by no means clear to us, and it's a messy and overlapping thing where we have to kind of arbitrarily draw lines and boundaries around things to try and make them make sense. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Brendan.
The end.